Hello and welcome back to Tips and Tricks That Every Woodworker Should Know, the show where you send us your tips and tricks and we talk about, show, and explain them. In today's episode, we're going to cover tips that'll help you improve your miter joints, clamp weird angles, reduce tear out, and save time and get better results when sanding. Thanks to everybody who's submitted tips so far, and if you want to submit one of your own, all the information's in the description. All right, Sean, let's hear the first tip.
All right, this first tip comes in from Hediob Nosh and is all about getting perfect looking mitered corners on boxes and cabinets. I remember as a newer woodworker, one of the techniques I found to be the trickiest to get just right were boxes with mitered corners, especially if I wanted to do something that had a grain match or a waterfall edge. And one of the issues that I ran into the most were my miter joints being a tiny bit open on that outside corner, which is really the most important spot from an aesthetic standpoint. There are plenty of reasons why this might happen, but a common factor is that when we attempt to set our blade to exactly 45 degrees, we miss it by just a fraction of a degree. The problem is that when this happens, because each joint has two bevel cuts, that small error is doubled, which can create that gap I was talking about a second ago. So to combat this, we can use a very simple trick, and that is, instead of attempting to set your blade to exactly 45 degrees, intentionally set it to just past that, like barely past. If you're using a small speed square, you can set the blade so that there's just a tiny gap near the bottom, just enough to see some light. Or if you're using one of these digital angle gauges, you can set it right as it ticks past 45. And what this does is guarantee that we will cut the bevel just a hair past 45, and that will result in our miter joints being closed at the top of the corner instead of the bottom when gluing up the entire box. And as you can see, because the blade was set just ever so slightly past 45 degrees, the entire joint still looks really good. A lot of times in woodworking, I say shoot for perfect, and there's usually a margin of error that we can work within if you slightly miss. But with something like miter joints, we only really want to miss one way. So this trick is kind of hedging our bets and making sure we miss to the side that will give us the better looking result. And honestly, because these outer corners are being pushed together more so than if we had cut the bevels at a perfect 45, we can argue that this will give us the best looking result out of everything. We'll put a couple links to projects where we've used this technique to get perfect looking miters in the description, so go check those out. All right, Chris, you have a tip for us?
Thanks, Sean. This next one comes into us from Anomalous Cirque, and it's all about clamping weird angles. Anytime you're faced with clamping something other than a perfectly right angle, things can get a little tricky. Even clamping 45-degree bevels on a 90-degree box can be hard. But things can get even more difficult when you're faced with something like this or this. So the first tip, which isn't really a tip, would be use some kind of clamping jig. Something like these clamping blocks can be really useful. We only have 7 of them, and I don't think you can buy these specifically anymore. So we even made one out of plywood. So if you want to make some, here's a quick little cheat sheet, and we'll also put a link in the description to some similar clamps that you can buy. And while these work pretty well, there are other solutions, so let's quickly cover a couple. So take something like this back leg subassembly for the long view chair that we built. Here you'd be trying to clamp an extremely obtuse angle, which is probably the hardest situation. So when it's possible, the best solution is planning ahead. Here I knew that this would be the case, so prior to cutting out my shapes, while I still had oversized workpieces, I could draw out the eventual shape on my workpiece to see approximately where I'd need to create clamping pressure. Then based on that line, I could clear out a couple of notches, drill in a few dowels, and glue and clamp the whole thing together. Now, this was a scenario where I happened to have a lot of extra material on my workpiece, so doing this was possible. But that's not always the case. And that leads me to my favorite, or Anomalous's favorite, clamping weird angle trick. Take, for example, something like the Pico console, which we also have plans for. Anyway, so if you look at the leg assembly, at the bottom we've got a couple of 40-degree angles that combine to make an 80-degree angle, and then at the top we've got another 40 and a 60-degree angle that'll make a 100-degree angle. So if you had them, you could use clamping blocks to tackle a job like this, but one of the downsides is, like you can see in this shot, you can pretty quickly burn through a lot of clamps going with this route. Here, for this single leg, you would need to use a minimum of 6 clamps and 4 clamping blocks. But what if I told you you could tackle this entire glue up with just 2 clamps and no clamping blocks? Because you can, sort of. You're still gonna need clamping blocks. The trick is, you've already made them, you just don't know it yet. So in order to make the 3 pieces that would become the leg, you'd have to cut these 4 joint faces. And as a byproduct of cutting these joint faces, you'd be left with these 4 offcut pieces. Well, by reorienting them, like you see in this color-coded animation, you can see that you've unintentionally created custom clamping blocks with perfectly complementary angles for optimized clamping pressure. So to tackle the job of assembling, you could opt for 6 clamps again, like you see in this shot, or you could just glue on your offcuts and use only 2 clamps. Just keep in mind that you're gonna need to remove and clean up the edges where you placed your clamping blocks down the road if you do glue them on. All right, Sean, you got another one for us? Oh,
phew. Thanks. I do have another tip, and this one is all about eliminating tear out by not really eliminating tear out. I know that kind of sounds like nonsense, so let me explain. We've all dealt with tear out when making cuts, and more specifically when making cross cuts or cuts that are perpendicular to the grain in a piece of wood. And there are plenty of great ways to help combat tear out before it happens. Maybe we'll get into some of those in another video, but for this one, it's all about the order in which we do things so that any tear out from a cross cut will ultimately get removed when a part is cut to final dimension with a rip cut, since that cut is happening parallel to the grain direction. So in the simplest terms, the idea is to cross cut, then rip whenever possible. One of the main places that I use this technique is when making drawer boxes and drawer fronts. When making a drawer box or a drawer front, I first cut all of my sides to length by cross-cutting, and I also cut rabbets at each corner of the drawer box to join all of the sides together. When I do all of this, there's plenty of opportunity to get tear out because most of these cuts happen perpendicular to the grain direction. So what I always do is make sure all of my drawer parts are left wide before I cut all of them to length and cut in all of the joinery in case I get some tear out like you can see here. Then the last thing I do is rip everything to width, often by taking a cut on both edges of each part, and this will remove any tear out that was left during the initial cross cuts, and at the same time, get all of my parts to final width. When used in the right situation, this is a great technique that doesn't take any extra time or extra tools and materials, and will leave you with tear out free parts, and who doesn't love that? All right, Chris, you have another one for us?
Well, another tip. But before we get to that, first let's take a minute to thank this video's sponsor, Squarespace. So I've been using Squarespace for over 5 years now, and it's been great. Prior to that, I used to code everything by hand, which is fine if you like doing that. But honestly, the outcome wasn't as good as it is now with the templates that I use with Squarespace. So in addition to Squarespace making it super easy to build and maintain your site, buy domains and all that stuff, they also have plenty of e-commerce, which has been really helpful since we started selling online woodworking courses. Things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allows us to easily manage online transactions. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one that you think could be better, you owe it to yourself to check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Just head over to squarespace.com/4eyes to start your free trial. And then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. All right, this next one's kind of tip adjacent, but it's something that could potentially save you from ruining a piece, so it's worth sharing. So I'm sure batch sanding pieces is something that we've all done. Probably the place it happens most frequently is when you're sanding the edges of identical parts. Say something like these chair legs, or maybe something like this slatted coffee table that I built a couple weeks ago. The basic idea is you clamp your pieces together, and this saves you time and ensures that your shapes stay more identical than they would if you were to try sanding them one by one. But another time where batch sanding can be really helpful is when you're sanding the faces of identical pieces. So going back to the chair example, sanding the faces of certain areas, particularly these, can get really tricky because there's such a little area for you to place your sander. So that means not only will your sander sand much more aggressively in these areas, but you're also going to be more prone to tipping or rocking your sander and basically messing up your shapes. So what I'll often do is batch pieces together like this so that I can sand multiple faces at the same time. This makes it way easier to stop your sander from tipping, and it also distributes the pressure of your sander over more surface, which just leads to better results. All right, as I said, not really a hardcore tip per se, but it can definitely save you from some potential heartache.
Okay, if you want to check out more woodworking tips and tricks, we'll have links to our other videos in the description. And if you want to submit a tip of your own, there will be information there as well. All right, have a great day.